Blue Origin launches a notable New Shepard passenger flight, Minotaur 4 launches from Vandenberg for the first time in over 14 years, and have scientists found life on an exoplanet? We've got all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. This week, Blue Origin launched New Shepard's 31st flight, and while notably this was the first all-female crew since Valentina Tereshkova's historic first woman in spaceflight in 1963, it got a lot more attention because of just who was on board. Liftoff took place on April 14th at 13:30 UTC from Blue Origin's Launch Site 1 in West Texas. The 6 passengers were NASA engineer and STEM advocate Aisha Bowe, civil rights activist Amanda Wynn, film producer Carrie Ann Flynn, TV host Gayle King, singer Katy Perry, and TV journalist Lauren Sanchez. Now, as you can imagine, due to the notoriety of some of these people, the flight has been making the rounds in mainstream media and also on social media, catching a lot of people who aren't already into space by surprise. For instance, many people who heard things like, "Katy Perry's going into space," had no idea that it was going to be for just a short hop, or that it was even possible to briefly go into space by doing that. So of course, there were also a number of memes comparing things like the length of this flight to the length of some of her songs. The flight has also attracted a bit of criticism, from it being a waste of time and resources, to some even arguing that it was fake, mainly, again, because they lack any knowledge about the New Shepard program or spaceflight in general. Other famous people also criticized the flight, claiming that it was harming the environment, ignoring the fact that they themselves own expensive cars and private jets, which probably contribute about the same amount of pollution as this launch. Now, one could say that this is all fair criticism. Like any other joyride or recreational event, why would someone waste their time and money on something like this instead of doing something more productive and useful? But like any other hobby or pastime, what's life if we can't have a little fun, right? One might argue that this is like the early days of passenger aircraft. Those also started at very high prices and were only within reach of the wealthiest people. But then as more people started flying on planes, the prices eventually went down, making it more accessible to those with less money. So the same could happen for spaceflight as well, or at least some of us really hope. But that being said, it's also true that this flight really didn't go anywhere. It essentially was the same flight plan as Alan Shepard's first historic flight, which, in terms of airplanes, was the equivalent of taking off, turning around, and then landing back at the same airport. Going to another destination, whether here on Earth or to other places in space, is probably a better comparison to that plane analogy, and it's in those kinds of flights where prices may someday go down and make space closer and within the reach of people with less resources. But at the same time, indirectly, this flight kind of actually helps in that sense. Blue Origin gets a ton of rocket experience thanks to flying New Shepard, and it's very likely that it's why New Glenn's first flight was so successful in placing its Blue Ring Pathfinder into its target orbit. These lessons could then later be introduced on a future crew capsule by Blue that actually launches into orbit. This comparison can also be drawn to other rocket companies like SpaceX. Falcon 1 helped with Falcon 9's success on its first flight, and in fact, it didn't fail until 19 launches into its career. Crew Dragon also wouldn't be here if it weren't for Dragon 1, and all of the lessons from Dragon are definitely going to help SpaceX carry crew on board Starship. As humans move to a future where being in space is much more common, we might even look back at missions like this and say they weren't much of a joyride after all. Yeah, but let's be real, this one kind of was a joyride. But that's okay. The mission probably gathered enough attention for Blue to sell even more tickets on New Shepard, and even though they are very pricey, someone with enough money might have noticed it and decided to buy a ride. I know I certainly would. And the publicity isn't really a bad thing per se. Amanda Wynn used her participation to highlight the role of science in promoting peace and reconciliation between the US and Vietnam, while Katy Perry used the opportunity to promote her upcoming tour and showed the set list during the flight. The crew as a whole also did say that they wanted to raise STEM awareness with this mission so that more people of all ages and abilities could be inspired to break barriers. I think they did that. And of course, you can't get that kind of awareness if you aren't making some noise.
1, 2, 3, take up space!
NASA continues to stack the SLS rocket that will launch the Artemis II mission on a trajectory around the moon for the first time since the days of Apollo. Artemis II is set to lift off about a year from now, but NASA is already preparing the rocket, and in the last few months, they've been stacking the solid rocket boosters, followed by the addition of the core stage. This week, the agency added the stage adapter on top of that. This is a cone-shaped structure that connects the core stage with the rocket's upper stage. While NASA lifted it into place on April 3rd, the mounting was completed just this week. The adapter connects to the core stage with 360 bolts, so it took a while to get them all installed and torqued correctly. The adapter's distinctive shape is a result of the two things that it connects. The SLS core stage on the bottom has a diameter of 8.4 meters, but it has to connect to an upper stage that's 5 meters wide. This upper stage is the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS to us space nerds, which is made by ULA and derived from the upper stage of the Delta rocket family. The ICPS for Artemis II has been completed for years and has been awaiting its launch while in storage at the Cape since 2021. But just this week, it finally arrived at the vehicle assembly building, ready to be stacked atop SLS very soon. As the interim part of the ICPS's name suggests, it will only be used for a few flights up to Artemis III. Artemis IV will then use the more powerful Exploration upper stage, which is developed specifically for SLS. The version of SLS that uses this stage is known as Block 1B, which will be much taller than the current version. Unfortunately, that also means that the launch tower used for the first 3 Artemis launches won't cut it, so NASA commissioned its contractor, Bechtel, to build a new tower. This tower is currently rising at the Kennedy Space Center, and just last week it got even taller as teams added another module on top of the tower. This addition brought the tower's height to around 73 meters, and it's set to gain another 46 meters before reaching its final height of nearly 120 meters. Now, this whole project is cloaked in controversy, as it's gone more than 3 times over its original budget, and to add insult to injury, it might not even be done on time. We covered this story in much more detail in a previous episode, and unfortunately, might have all been for nothing. Last week, Jared Isaacman had his confirmation hearing in the US Senate to become the next NASA administrator, and during that meeting, he hinted that the new administration might reconsider the plans for Artemis IV and beyond.
I don't think it's the long-term way to get to and from the moon and to Mars with great frequency, but this is the plan we have now, and we've got to get this crew around the moon and the follow-on crew to land on the moon.
So depending on how things turn out, SLS Block 1B might be on the chopping block soon, and if that happens, NASA won't need that new tower after all. Now, all that said, his plans for Artemis 2 and 3 are more favorable, as it seems that he wants to keep those missions and believes that they are the quickest way to get back to the moon. After all, the missions have been in the works for a long time, and for Artemis 2, most of the rocket has already been completed, and the crew has been training for a few years now. So what's left to do to get this mission off the ground? Well, the next step is to stack the ICPS on top of the stage adapter. After that, NASA and Boeing are planning to do more work on the core stage, including replacing an entire engine. This engine developed a small hydraulic leak, which is easier to fix outside of the vehicle or even be swapped for another engine. Meanwhile, teams will also plug in umbilicals and perform integrated tests and checkouts. All this work should be completed before the end of summer. As all of this is happening, the Orion spacecraft is also being readied for its mission. It'll soon be loaded with commodities, then moved to another facility where it'll be outfitted with its launch abort system. Orion should then be ready for stacking on top of SLS by the end of the summer. Before Artemis II is ready to launch, NASA plans to perform at least one tanking test. Then SLS and Orion will roll out to the pad, hopefully by the end of the year, ready for launch. If everything plays out as planned, SLS and Orion should be ready for Artemis II much earlier than the currently scheduled launch window of April 2026. The agency has dropped some hints that they might indeed be aiming for an earlier date, but many things have to go right for NASA to be able to pull that off. If you want to follow along, tune into future episodes and subscribe to our channel to make sure you won't miss it. And if you like our space news coverage, why not give us a like too? Is there life beyond Earth? That question has kept scientists busy for a long time, and space agencies around the world keep launching missions to try to answer that very question. But this week, the James Webb Space Telescope may have spotted a strong sign of life on a planet 124 light-years away. It's a tantalizing glimpse of what might be out there, but don't start dreaming of making interstellar friends just yet. As is often the case with science news, it turns out that there are a lot of nuances to this story. So let's dive in. Using Webb, a team of scientists analyzed the light signal from an exoplanet known as K2-18b, and that signal revealed the signature of two chemical compounds, dimethyl sulfide, or DMS, and dimethyl disulfide, DMDS. On Earth, these molecules are only known to be produced by life, specifically microbial life. In fact, most of the stuff is produced by phytoplankton in the world's seas and oceans. Coincidentally, scientists suspect that the exoplanet this study focused on is a so-called Hycean planet. Now, this is a world with an ocean of liquid water under a hydrogen-rich atmosphere. K2-18b orbits within the habitable zone of a red dwarf star that was first observed by the Kepler Space Telescope in 2015. The scientists who worked on this study discovered this potential ocean in 2023 when they used Webb to analyze the planet's light spectrum. Back then, they already got the first signs that there might be dimethyl sulfide on this world, but the signal wasn't strong enough to be sure. So they pointed Webb at this planet again about a year ago, and the results of these observations were published just this week. With this latest data, scientists confirmed what they saw in 2023 and also provided evidence for the presence of an extra compound. They're fairly certain about their results too. In scientific terms, their results have a significance of 3 sigma, meaning there's a 0.3% chance that the observations were a result of chance. Now that seems tiny, but it's not perfect, and scientists prefer the even smaller possibility of erroneous results of 5 sigma, or a 0.00006% chance of a fluke, and that's not just out of an abundance of caution. While the DMS and DMDS molecules fit the observations very well, there might be some other molecule, or perhaps a combination of molecules, that explains the data even better. The scientists explored only 20 options, and there are many more options left to try. Alternatively, there could be something different about the way these molecules interact with a hydrogen-rich atmosphere compared to the nitrogen-rich atmosphere that we're used to here on Earth. If that's the case, the observed chemical signal might match these molecules by complete coincidence. But even if we ignore all of that and assume that Webb did indeed spot these molecules on this planet, are we really sure that it's a sign of life? Well, for that, we can turn to the cold scale, which determines the confidence of life detection in several steps. Detection of a possible signal is only the first step in the process. One of the steps where this exoplanet might eventually fail is ruling out a non-biological explanation. We know that on Earth, these molecules are only produced by life, but that doesn't mean that they can't be produced in any other way. In fact, there have been several studies that have created these compounds without using life. There are even reports that the stuff might have been found on a comet, and scientists are pretty confident that it got there without life. Confirming the discovery of life beyond our own planet requires extraordinary evidence, and on its own, this study just isn't enough. The team behind this study wants to point Webb at this planet again to collect more data, which might help to increase the certainty of this finding to the desired 5 sigma. Other studies are also needed to confirm that the same detection can't be explained by some other chemicals that haven't been considered yet. The evidence for extraterrestrial life provided by this latest study might not be as strong as it seemed at first, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. As we keep training our telescopes on worlds other than our own, we'll keep adding more pieces, and one day we might get to see the full picture and finally get that undeniable evidence that we are not alone. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting from India. The Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO, is making progress with its program to develop a winged body reusable launch vehicle. In other words, they're building a space plane. ISRO has been working on this for over a decade, and the goal is to eventually develop a 2-staged reusable launch vehicle that has a space plane for its upper stage. At the current stage of the program, they're working on a scaled-down prototype that's also known as Pushpak. The technology demonstrator flew for the first time on a suborbital launch in 2016, during which ISRO tested the spaceplane's design during hypersonic flight. The same flight also validated the heat shield, as well as the navigation, guidance, and control systems. Last year, ISRO wrapped a series of 3 tests, during which Pushpak was dropped from a helicopter to test its autonomous landing system. These tests really put the spaceplane through its paces, not only simulating a nominal landing, but also some extreme conditions for which it had to show off its ability to steer onto the right trajectory. Earlier this month, ISRO commissioned a new test facility specifically for testing spaceplane landing gear. Here, they can test the performance of different types of landing gear under various conditions and simulate different aircraft, airport altitudes, and runway types. All of this is needed to develop the next version of Pushpak that will perform an orbital test. The vehicle for this flight will be 1.6 times the size of the spaceplane that performed the previous series of tests. It'll be launched into a 400-kilometer orbit, and after circling the Earth a few times, it'll re-enter and land on a runway. If all goes well, we might see this flight lift off as soon as next year. Redwire has joined forces with the U.S. arm of Tokyo-based iSpace to deliver future lunar missions for NASA. This week, the two companies announced their intention to collaborate on future contract bids under the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, or CLPS. They're also looking to work with commercial customers as the lunar exploration market continues to grow. iSpace US is already working on its next-generation Apex lunar lander, which will head to the Schrödinger Basin on the far side of the Moon in 2026. This lander has a 300-kilogram payload capacity, which is 10 times more than the Series 1 model used on iSpace's 2 Hokuto R missions. Resilience, the second of these, is still in transit to the Moon and is expected to land on June 6th in the Mare Frigoris region. Future landers would benefit from Redwire's expertise in critical infrastructure and technologies such as deployable systems. Redwire was also awarded a contract from Thales Alenia Space this week. The company will build the docking system for the European Space Agency's Lunar IHAB module. The habitation space for up to 4 astronauts is part of NASA's Lunar Gateway project and is due to launch aboard the Artemis IV mission no earlier than 2028. Rocket Lab's Hypersonic Accelerator Suborbital Test Electron, or HASTE, program has received approval to launch missions supporting the defense programs of the United States and the United Kingdom. HASTE is a variant of the Electron rocket that features a modified kick stage designed for hypersonic and suborbital testing, along with an increased payload capacity of 700 kilograms compared to Electron's 300 kilogram capacity. Rocket Lab has been approved by the United States Air Force, as well as the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, to pursue defense contracts for the HASTE vehicle. The plan for this variant is to assist the two entities in testing new designs or concepts for any object needed in the real-world hypersonic or suborbital environment. Additionally, Rocket Lab can now propose HASTE to either the US Air Force or the UK Ministry of Defense for many contracts where it would be the best option, thereby saving taxpayers money and possibly securing more funding for Rocket Lab. While no contracts have been awarded to HASTE by either entity at this time, the vehicle's potential selection for specific missions in the future is an important next step for the program, and it could bring in some more money to the company. This week, the 100th Tianqia engine rolled off the production line in China. Landspace will use 9 of these on the first stage of its forthcoming Zhuqian 3 rocket, slated to take its maiden flight in the second half of this year. The engines now include 3D printed technologies, which have increased the production rate and reduced waste. Zhuqian 3 is similar in height and payload capacity to the Falcon 9, but is constructed from stainless steel, and its engines use methane fuel instead of kerosene. Last September's 10-kilometer hop test of a subscale booster proved aspects such as an in-flight engine restart and accurate landing control less than 2 meters from its target. Its predecessor, the Zhuqian 2, became the world's first methane-fueled rocket to reach orbit back in December of 2022. Most recently in November, the enhanced version, the Zhuqian 2E, made its successful debut flight using the Tianqia 15A vacuum-optimized engine that will also power the upper stage of Zhuqian 3. The first Zhuqian 3 vehicle recently completed assembly and will now undergo ground testing and verification tests of its 2 stages. It could launch from Zhochuan as soon as July and is set to become China's first reusable carrier, though the first attempted landing of a first stage wouldn't be until a later mission next year. Blue Origin's Orbital Reef space station has undergone human testing for the first time. Utilizing a life-sized mock-up on Earth, individuals in small groups navigated the anticipated layout of the station in a simulated microgravity environment. The simulation created authentic scenarios that might occur on the station in the future. Several specific tests were conducted to ensure that cargo transfer, trash disposal, stowage, and worksite evaluations could be effectively completed without necessitating design modifications. Day-in-the-life tests were also conducted, designed to identify minor issues in the design that could only be revealed through prolonged exposure to Orbital Reef. This experiment, known as human-in-the-loop testing, ensures the station's livability and operational effectiveness. Its aim is to identify minor design flaws that may have been overlooked, helping Blue Origin to avoid costly fixes that might be necessary in orbit by catching the issues today. It's still early in the design phase of Orbital Reef, so any problems that are identified can be addressed, improving the overall design for the astronauts who will use it in orbit. Future human-in-the-loop testing is already planned for once the updates have been added to the mock-up station, and will continue until all kinks are resolved and the Orbital Reef's design is finalized. Now let's take a look at the space traffic of the week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week, we had the launch of a Falcon 9 from Vandenberg, lifting off on April 12th at 12:25 UTC. The mission, NROL-192, carried the latest batch of Starshield satellites for the NRO's Proliferated Space Architecture constellation. This was the 9th Falcon 9 launch in support of that constellation, with the agency expecting a handful more before the end of the year. The booster for this mission was a veteran one, flying for a 24th time and successfully landing on SpaceX's drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. Next, moving to Florida, we had another 2 Falcon 9 launches this week. The first one lifted off from Launch Complex 39A on April 13th at 53 minutes past midnight UTC. The mission carried a mixed batch of Starlink V2 Mini and Starlink Direct-to-Cell satellites on board. The first stage for this mission, B-1083, was flying for a 10th time, becoming the 19th booster in the Falcon fleet to fly 10 or more times. This flight also marked the 400th time that a Falcon booster was reflown. After completing its primary mission, it successfully landed on SpaceX's drone ship, A Shortfall of Gravitas. The other launch from Florida was another Starlink, but this one was special. The mission started off from Space Launch Complex 40 on April 14th at 4 o'clock UTC. The rocket was carrying 27 Starlink V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. But the special treat was the first stage for this mission, B-1067, which flew for a record 27th time. This Life Leader booster is now the first to have flown that many times, and it may just keep pushing the record because it successfully returned to Earth, landing on the deck of Just Read the Instructions, and, most importantly, returned in one piece back to Port Canaveral. To wrap up the week, we had the launch of a Minotaur 4 from Vandenberg. For the first time in over 14 years since its last launch from Space Launch Complex 8, Minotaur sprung to the skies on April 16th at 1933 UTC. Much like its previous missions, this one was a classified launch for the Department of Defense, in particular for the National Reconnaissance Office. As is common with classified missions, not much is known, although given the performance of the Minotaur 4 rocket, this launch most likely went into a low Earth orbit. Next week in space traffic, we'll have a few more launches, a flyby in deep space, and also a return from space. From SpaceX, we're expecting 2 Starlink launches and 1 Starshield launch, launching from Vandenberg and Cape Canaveral. On Monday, the company is also aiming to launch its next commercial resupply services mission to the International Space Station with its Dragon spacecraft. Later that same day, SpaceX is also expected to launch its 3rd Bandwagon mission as part of its smallsat rideshare program. Both launches, CRS-32 and Bandwagon 3, will feature a return-to-launch site landing, so expect lots of sonic booms if you're in the Space Coast area. But on Sunday, before SpaceX launches its next Dragon to the ISS, we'll also have the return of the Soyuz MS-26 spacecraft with Alexei Ovchinin, Ivan Wagner, and Don Pettit on board. Prior to their departure, Alexei Ovchinin will hand over command of the station to Takuya Onishi, who launched on board SpaceX's Crew 10 mission just last month. And out in deep space this weekend, NASA's Lucy spacecraft will meet with asteroid 52246 Donald Johanson. The closest approach of just less than 1,000 kilometers away is expected to take place on April 20th at 1751 UTC. This will be the second asteroid the spacecraft visits in its over decade-long mission to explore the main asteroid belt and Jupiter's Trojan asteroids. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.